Good evening. I'm Susan Zesch. I'm Executive Director of the Human Rights Program and a senior lecturer in the college. I want to welcome everyone here to the Robert Kirschner Memorial Lecture, which also is the 15th anniversary of our program. It's particularly apt that we can combine celebrating Bob Kirschner's legacy with that of the entire program, because Bob was really a Renaissance man. Those who knew him knew that he loved art, music, food, and many of the good things of life, and was also a dedicated and brilliant forensic pathologist whose work in the United States and across the world brought recognition to the University of Chicago and a great deal of satisfaction to Bob himself and the people who worked with him. We're particularly thankful to his family, Dr. Barbara Kirschner and Bob's sons and other relatives who have created a fund that supports this lecture series. I just want to give you about a 2-minute report on the activities of the Human Rights Program, because we have a number of our former alumni here, and I think they want to catch up with what is going on. We are a fairly unique program among human rights programs at universities across the country by nature of our true interdisciplinary reach. We have faculty and students from across the campus. We have a curriculum which spans the liberal arts, which is dedicated to our model that we call theory, practice, theory, where we prepare our students in a University of Chicago way to really understand the theory behind human rights from a variety of disciplines, and then through our internship program and other projects, send them out into the world to understand what the practice of human rights is about. They then come back and have an enriched academic experience, with their experiences being transmitted into their BA theses, into doctoral work, and into master's theses. And we're very proud of the fact that we do believe that human rights is important and lawyers play an important role, but it's not a field that is only the property of lawyers. We have been able, due to the generosity of donors, many of whom are in the audience, and particularly Richard and Ann Posen, to increase our support for faculty and student research. We're now giving grants to faculty to develop new human rights courses. We're giving grants to graduate students to go off and do research in archives and do interviews across the world. And we are also now supporting faculty student-initiated projects that analyze real-world problems. This year, we have launched a major effort on health and human rights, which promotes dialogue about health and human rights on the south side of Chicago, in China, and in Haiti. We will be expanding our efforts in 2013-14 with support from the university's Neubauer Collegium, and we will send out publicity about public activities in that project. We also have a project which we call Human Rights at Home, and following on the example of W.E.B. Du Bois and his petition to the United Nations in 1947, which was written, we discovered in the last year, with the help of two prominent Southsiders, Earl B. Dickerson, the first African-American graduate of this law school, and William Ming, who was the first African-American faculty member of this law school. Each wrote one of the 5 chapters in the 1947 NAACP petition, An Appeal to the World, to the newly formed Human Rights Commission of the UN. But that's a whole story in itself, which we will tell you at various programs throughout the year, and so we will invite you to come back. And then the last project I wanted to mention is a very interesting faculty initiative looking at the tensions, overlaps, and differences between humanitarianism and human rights. We will be presenting a conference in the fall which looks at forced migration and how both humanitarian groups and human rights groups deal with that phenomenon, and it's a conference presented by historians. And then in the spring, we will have another conference on really getting into the history of the development of those two approaches to the solving of social problems. As you know, we do support for student internships, and we're very proud of the work that our interns do when they're abroad. And I know that some of our present and former interns are here, and I would particularly be interested in if the people who are here who are alumni of the program or interns can raise their hands. Stand up so people can see you. Please, just for a minute, the alums who have come back to celebrate with us. Welcome and thank you. Now, I want to give you just one, since I'm going to be a little bit opportunistic about this, one piece of proof of how our internship program works. A number of you probably saw the cover story in this Sunday's New York Times Magazine, which was written by Ben Austin, son of our friends Ralph and Ernestine Austin. Ralph is an emeritus professor of history of Africa. And in the article, which in the online version is headlined, "How the Housing Crisis in Chicago Ignited a New Form of Activism," I found the following paragraph. The idea for the anti-eviction campaign actually came from South Africa. Toussaint Lousier had traveled there to study the direct action tactics of an organization called the Western Cape Anti-Eviction Campaign. Its members had been putting their bodies in front of homes to block evictions, building their own squatter settlements on unused land. So J.R. Fleming of the south side of Chicago and Toussaint, who got to know each other when the chairman of the South African group visited Cabrini Green, started a Chicago chapter together. Well, Toussaint Lousier that summer had been in South Africa on an internship grant from this very human rights program. We're very pleased to see that we can claim such direct results and that Ben Austin gave us the publicity we think our interns deserve. And so I would ask you, when you look at those envelopes that we put into the programs tonight, to think about if you can join with our other generous donors, many of whom are here in the room, in supporting our internships. Before I yield the stage to Mark Bradley, who's going to introduce our speaker, first to Renzel Scher, who's going to tell us about all the students who've gotten an award, I want to say something about Sarah Moberg. Sarah Moberg, who's in the back of the room in her green blouse and directing and organizing this program, has been the backbone of the administrative part of the Human Rights Program for the last 6 years. This program would not be where it is without Sarah's diligent work, not only dealing with administrative and financial matters, but also coming up with ideas for very interesting conferences from a seminar we did a couple of years ago called about cities, understanding the nature of cities, and then a panel that got great attention and which will be repeated on CAN TV on privatization, human rights, and education, looking at the Chicago public schools. Sarah's about to leave us to go off to the University of Illinois at Chicago to start a PhD in sociology, and I want to thank her publicly for the fabulous work she's done over the last 6 years. Again, I want to thank the Kirschner family for their support of this program, and Ann and Richard Posen, our major benefactors, who make a lot of our activities possible. And you can see the names of all the entities of the university that also support us or in the program. And now Renzel Scher, co-chair of our board, noted epidemiologist, instructor of health and human rights, will recognize our award winners.
Thanks, Susan. I'm Renzel Scher. I'm a professor of medicine in the section of infectious diseases and global health and the co-chair for the Faculty Executive Committee for the Department of Human Rights. And I also want to thank Sarah Moberg. I could not have been a teacher at the college without her help because I knew nothing about it before starting that process. I get the privilege of acknowledging the wonderful spread of the human rights program here throughout undergraduate and graduate school in the personage of the individuals that I'm going to recognize. And all the information that I'm giving you is in your program. So as I describe the individuals, if they would please just stand up and be recognized. The first is the Ignacio Martin Barro Human Rights Essay Prize for 2013. He was a Jesuit priest from El Salvador who earned a PhD here at the University of Chicago. He and 7 others were assassinated by the Salvadoran army in 1989 for their efforts on behalf of the dispossessed in El Salvador, and this award was created after his death by his friends and continues to hold a tremendous meaning. And the winner this year for the prize, this is the 11th year that we've awarded the prize, first in the undergraduates, Heather Lyon in anthropology, and she wrote on Breaking the Silence, Transitional Justice in Chicago. In the Masters in Professional category, there are 3 recipients, so please stand up. Alexander Bergerson in law, and on the topic incorporating the ICSCR into the World Trade Organization, challenges and opportunities. Valerie Guerra in the School of Social Service Administration on child soldiers, gang members, reconceptualizing urban violence in America. And Jonah Rubin in anthropology for transitional justice against the state, implications of the local interpretations of truth, justice, and reconciliation. The second award is for the Dr. Isaac Wolf Human Rights Post-Baccalaureate Fellowship for 2013-14. This was established by a physician who now practices in Miami, a surgeon who's an alumnus of the University of Chicago. This is the 7th annual Isaac Wolf Award. The winner this year is Julia Cizek, and she's in anthropology and international studies for her study on the Kumeyaay Degüeno Land Conservancy and National American Land Conservancy in California. Congratulations. Happily, as Susan mentioned, the Human Rights Program gives graduate research grants for $3,000 each. There are 15 of them, so I'll go through all 15, and then we can acknowledge those folks at the end. It's important. This program is unique in the United States for supporting individuals who are working in other disciplines to allow and enable them to inject human rights issues and interventions into their existing topics. So please stand as I read your name and be recognized. First, Maria Balandran Castillo in history, Amanda Blair in political science, Catherine Duda in Slavic languages and literature, Corey Garibaldi in history, Claudia Gastro in anthropology, Myra Hyatt in anthropology, Dongyoung Kim in anthropology, Chengpong Lee in sociology, John McCallum in history, Claire McKinney in political science, Megan Morris in anthropology, Duff Morton in anthropology, Christopher Sheklian in anthropology, Jeremy Seigman in anthropology and political science, and Eva Swingadoo in sociology. So finally, there are two remaining responsibilities, and these folks are listed in your program. They are the 2013 graduates, the human rights intern. Internships are awarded to college and graduate professional students for a total of $5,000 each. And these are very highly competitive awards for summer work in NGOs or cultural institutions around the world. All of those individuals from the college, from SSA, from the Harris School and the medical school are listed in your program. So would all of those graduates stand up, please, and we'll acknowledge you. Congratulations to you all. And then finally, the Human Rights Program supports minors, again, in the idea of expanding the interdisciplinarity of the Human Rights Program throughout the college. That started 5 years ago, and the names of all of the human rights minors, too long to list, are listed in the program. Would you, the minors, please stand and be recognized as well? I don't know how it was that I got the best job of the night, but I'm very grateful to Susan for letting me do this. Let me remind you there's a reception immediately following this presentation. Thank you all for coming out and supporting this program tonight and all through the year. Thanks very much.
Friends, we don't generally get a beautiful oriental carpet to stand on as we're doing our various talks, but this is really lovely. I'm Mark Bradley, a faculty member in the history department, and like Ren's, one of the co-chairs of the Faculty Advisory Board for the Human Rights Program. The suffering of strangers beyond American shores came to matter in the 1970s in ways that it had never done before. And in part, Aryeh Neier made that so. The decade of the 1970s brought a surge of some 383, and I've counted, American-based groups who for the first time identified themselves in one form or another as human rights non-governmental organizations. Some of these groups were in fact founded decades earlier, but turned their attention more intensively to human rights in the 1970s. But most are what we would call today startups. And among those startups was Human Rights Watch, now perhaps the premier non-state human rights organization in the world, and a leader in the transformative developments that have shaped today's global human rights order. Neier was present at creation. Indeed, he was in critical ways one of the prime architects of these transformations. And now, with the publication of his most recent book, The International Human Rights Movement from Princeton in 2012, he is also one of the most important narrators of those events and their larger meanings. Neier came to his work on human rights via the ACLU, where he began working in 1963 and would eventually serve as the organization's executive director for 8 years. Now, there was a Chicago connection here, or perhaps to be more specific about it, a Skokie connection here. Neier, in my understanding, has never been a person to evade controversy, and he himself escaped from Nazi Germany with his parents in the 1930s, made the decision to provide ACLU support for the right of American Nazis to march through Skokie, a decision that he chronicled in his 1979 book, Defending My Enemy. And I must say, every time I drive through Skokie, it's hard for me to forget that moment in time. The name Human Rights Watch and the global mandate that it connotes were not, in fact, adopted until 1988. But the organization that was built by Neier and others was really constructed on a series of regional organizations that began with the establishment of Helsinki Watch in the late 1970s and America's Watch in the 1980s. And they helped to establish the repertoire of non-state interventions for human rights. On-the-ground, authoritative fact-finding missions, fostering media coverage, and direct engagement with policymakers. In the years that followed under Neier's direction, Human Rights Watch continued to expand its geographical scope and helped to put into place the international juridical mechanisms that aim to bring accountability for genocide and gross violations of human rights that today are manifested in a variety of domestic and international courts and tribunals. After 12 years as director of Human Rights Watch, Neier moved to the Open Society Foundations, where he served as president from 1993 to 2012, and among other initiatives was deeply involved in efforts to create the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Here, Neier was at the forefront of what Catherine Sickink has recently termed the International Human Rights Justice Cascade. It's a great pleasure to welcome Aryeh Neier, President Emeritus of the Open Society Foundations, to the University of Chicago to deliver this year's Robert Kirschner Memorial Human Rights Lecture. His talk this evening is titled, What Has the International Human Rights Movement Accomplished? All right.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be asked to give a lecture that is named for Robert Kirschner. I had an opportunity to work with Robert Kirschner. I didn't know him well. We didn't work together a great deal. But I was very mindful of his work because it had a pioneering role in the engagement of scientists in human rights efforts. And that engagement has proved to be enormously significant. We just had a trial in Guatemala of the country's former dictator, Efraín Ríos Montt, who led the country some 30 years ago, and under whose direction what a United Nations-sponsored commission called Acts of Genocide took place. At the trial that just took place, among the most important testimony was the testimony of Guatemalan forensic anthropologists who testified about the skeletons that they had exhumed and what they learned about how people died and who the persons were who died, so that their testimony showing that a large number of those who died were executed rather than died in combat, and that a very large number of them were children, was immensely important in the trial of General Rios Montt. And even though the 80-year sentence imposed on General Rios Montt was vacated by a higher court for reasons that are somewhat difficult to comprehend, the fact that that trial took place in Guatemala, the fact that scientific testimony took place in that trial, helping to demonstrate the validity of the claims of the surviving witnesses, was immensely important, I think, in that country and also globally. My topic is what has the international human rights movement accomplished. And I think before I get to that, I ought to speak briefly about the emergence of the human rights movement as a movement and what I mean when I talk of a movement. Also, I will say a little bit about what the human rights movement has not accomplished. The international human rights movement acquired the characteristics of a movement in the mid-1970s, about the same time as two other citizen movements that also spread globally, the women's movement and the environmental movement. I think nothing like them had ever existed previously. They are secular movements of citizens that do not depend on particular leaders or particular institutions to sustain themselves. They've taken hold in greater or lesser degree in all regions of the world, and they are active in all but a handful of the most repressive countries on earth. They are all still growing in the number of their adherents and in their significance. They have a long way to go to achieve their goals, and perhaps they will never achieve their goals. They will only continue to struggle for their goals. But they are having an immensely important effect, and they have inspired the formation of other citizen movements, such as the gay rights movement and the disability rights movement and the transparency and accountability movement. The three major global citizen movements each had predecessors. In the case of the international human rights movement, the earliest and most important, in my view, was the anti-slavery movement that got started in England in the latter part of the 18th century. It wasn't the first time that citizens joined together to advocate rights, but the nature of the anti-slavery movement was that people were not advocating on behalf of their own rights. They were advocating on behalf of the rights of others. And by its nature, the anti-slavery movement was international because, of course, slavery operated internationally. The anti-slavery movement, of course, over time ended or largely ended organized slavery, and its accomplishment, therefore, is a major historical factor. An organization that played a leading role in giving birth to today's international human rights movement was Amnesty International, which began more than 50 years ago in 1961. I think it was the first organization in any field formed to promote a secular cause on a worldwide basis that enlisted a large number of persons globally as its constituents. Today, Amnesty has close to 3 million dues-paying members worldwide. Greenpeace, which played a somewhat similar role in the environmental field in enlisting a large global constituency, got started a decade later than Amnesty. As far as the emergence of the human rights movement in the 1970s, I don't think there was any single event that we can say was the main factor. Rather, I think it was the confluence of a number of events. I think one of them was the coup by Augusto Pinochet in Chile in 1973, and the international outrage at the torture and the killings that accompanied the coup, and also the international outrage at the role of the United States in supporting Pinochet and helping Pinochet come to power. I think another was the forced resignation of Richard Nixon as President of the United States in August 1974 for violating rights within the United States. I think that the Helsinki Accords of August 1975, and much more important, the formation of the Moscow-Helsinki movement or Helsinki group shortly thereafter to promote the rights which the Soviet Union said it subscribed to in signing the Helsinki Accords. I think that was another of the factors of the 1970s. I think it was the Soweto riots in South Africa in 1976, and the murder shortly thereafter of Steve Biko that focused attention on the apartheid system in South Africa. I think it was the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Amnesty International in 1977. And I think it was also the emergence of the democracy wall movement in China, which was the most surprising development of that decade, because China had only shortly before that emerged from the Cultural Revolution. And who could have imagined that a spark of commitment to human rights was present in that vast totalitarian system that had been entirely cut off from the, almost entirely cut off from the rest of the world during the decade of the Cultural Revolution. I think all of those things came together in the 1970s and brought about this surge of interest in human rights internationally. I think it's also important that the human rights movement emerged at a time when international affairs were dominated by the Cold War. And I think that the events that I've described all took on heightened significance because of the Cold War struggle for hearts and minds. Critics of the Soviet system celebrated those in Russia and Poland and Czechoslovakia who resisted communist repression. These were very small groups. The Moscow-Helsinki group had a total of 11 members when it started, and it didn't get much larger than that before most of those 11 got sent to prison, but it attracted worldwide attention. In turn, opponents of the Western powers called attention to the suffering of victims of human rights abuses in many anti-communist military dictatorships and in South Africa. And the emerging human rights movement came to the defense of those persecuted by both sides and thereby established its legitimacy as a principled and nonpartisan defender of rights. I think the movement was shaped by Cold War considerations, and in turn, the emergence of the human rights movement helped to shape the remainder of the Cold War. Cold War concerns had played an important role in the development of Amnesty International. From the start, the organization had a rule that the local groups it established, which were active on behalf of prisoners of conscience in different parts of the world, had to be concerned with prisoners of conscience in countries aligned with the Soviet Union, with prisoners of conscience aligned with Western countries, and with prisoners of conscience that were in the non-aligned states. There were, of course, human rights groups that came along that were only concerned with abuses by left-wing governments and those that were only concerned with abuses by right-wing governments. But the groups that emerged and survived and acquired strength, like Human Rights Watch, followed the example of Amnesty International and took great care to deal with human rights abuses, regardless of the political or geopolitical alignment of the governments that engaged in abuses. An early impact of the human rights movement on the Cold War was to contribute to a change in the way that the Cold War was discussed. In the early period of the Cold War, it was common to refer to it as a struggle between communism and capitalism, or communism and free enterprise. And when you saw propaganda from the West, it would often include pictures of suburban homes with shiny cars in front of them, and propaganda from the Soviet bloc countries would show muscular workers in huge grain fields or at work in large factories, and they would show slum conditions in urban centers in the West as part of their propaganda. A famous episode in that early period was the so-called kitchen debate between Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev that took place in 1959 in Moscow. Nixon was then vice president representing the United States at an international fair. And Americans thought that Nixon had triumphed in the debate because he had pointed to all these labor-saving devices in the model kitchen that had been established at that fair. So that was the way the Cold War was often conceived in that early period. The human rights movement did not originate or did not initiate the shift in thinking about the Cold War. That is, scholars and philosophers like Isaiah Berlin and Hannah Arendt and Raymond Aron and Leszek Kolakowski and Czesław Miłosz and a few others characterized the struggle as political and philosophical. And I think that approach began to dominate thinking about the struggle between East and West. It was totalitarianism or repression versus liberty. But I think that the human rights movement contributed to the shift in emphasis, and particularly after the 1975 Helsinki Accords, made the question of human rights central in the struggle. But at the same time, the human rights movement took advantage of its position as a critic of Soviet abuses of human rights to turn the tables on the United States with respect to its patronage of right-wing military dictatorships in Latin America, in Asia, its patronage for the apartheid regime in South Africa, and used that as a way of embarrassing the United States to diminish or to terminate the kind of support that it had provided to many of those right-wing dictatorships. This was particularly important after Ronald Reagan became president in 1981. Reagan initially strongly resisted the efforts of the human rights movement. His associates had denounced the human rights movement because they said that the Carter administration's criticism of human rights abuses in Iran under the Shah had allowed the emergence of the Khomeini regime. The Carter administration's criticism of human rights abuses under Somoza in Nicaragua had allowed the emergence of the Sandinistas. And so the Reagan administration was intent on turning its back on the human rights movement. But by that time, there was enough support for the human rights cause in Congress, in the press, from the human rights organizations, so that the Reagan administration really was not able to persist with that. And then Reagan tried to redirect or reconceive the human rights effort as an effort to promote democracy worldwide. That ultimately had a significant impact, because the Reagan administration, which had been very supportive of these right-wing regimes, ultimately found itself having to pull the rug out from under Marcos in the Philippines and Duvalier in Haiti, and even eventually Pinochet in Chile. When the Reagan administration had come into office, it had been strongly supportive of Pinochet. Ultimately, in Reagan's last year, Pinochet had organized a plebiscite on whether he should continue in office. No opponent, just a yes or no vote. And as it got towards the date of the plebiscite, Pinochet realized that he was going to lose his own plebiscite, and he wanted to cancel it. And the Reagan administration forced him to go forward. And he lost the plebiscite, and that's what brought an end to the Pinochet regime in Chile. I think that those accomplishments, those Cold War accomplishments of helping on the one hand to demonize Soviet repression, and at the same time to make it difficult for the United States to persist with its support for military regimes and right-wing regimes in other parts of the world, were among the most important accomplishments of the human rights movement. Although there were those achievements in the Cold War period, there hasn't been a possibility for the human rights movement subsequent to that to play a role of comparable geopolitical significance. We thought at the time that the Cold War ended and those right-wing regimes were all falling apart, that we were entering a sort of golden age for human rights. And the one thing that really marred that period was what happened in China in Tiananmen Square in 1989. But many of us at that point, I'm afraid I was among them, thought that that was only a temporary setback in China, that we had seen transformations everywhere else, and there would also be a transformation in China. Obviously, that has not taken place. China has been immensely successful economically during that period. It has not only maintained its repressive character within China, but it is a force for political repression in other parts of the world. When Western governments sometimes try to use human rights pressure against countries with which they do business, China offers itself as an alternative which will simply go along with whatever repression is taking place, and therefore very frequently undercuts efforts emanating from Western countries to exercise influence on human rights. If the West says to Angola that we would like you to open up in this way or that way in order to get assistance from the international financial institutions or to engage in trade with us, China comes along as a bigger economic player than the international financial institutions or than what is available through Western commerce, and therefore Angola feels no pressure to open up, and the system remains as it has been in Angola for very many years. I got a personal illustration recently of the degree of control that the Chinese government exercises. I had an opportunity to spend quite a lot of time recently with a prominent Chinese scientist who is the vice rector of one of the country's leading universities. And the person impressed me as an independent thinker. And yet, when I mentioned names like Liu Xiaobo, who had received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010 and is serving an 11-year prison sentence, or even the name of the artist Ai Weiwei, my Chinese friend did not recognize those names. There had simply been sufficient control over the dissemination of information so that a sophisticated person who speaks English well did not know names that are probably the best known Chinese names outside of China. Following the end of the Cold War, there were further indications that we had not quite entered a golden era, particularly in the conflicts that took place in the former Yugoslavia and the genocide that took place in Rwanda. And even though the human rights movement demonstrated little capacity to do anything significant about those tremendous abuses of human rights that took place not long after the end of the Cold War, it was possible to use them as a way of making some significant or achieving some significant developments that I think are having a long-lasting effect. As an outgrowth of the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, it was possible for the human rights movement to initiate the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and after the Rwandan genocide took place, the UN also created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. When the Yugoslav Tribunal was created, there were a great many skeptics. There was no indication of how it would get custody of those who were indicted for war crimes. Today, 20 years after the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, it has obtained custody of every single one of the persons who it indicted, except those who died before they could be taken into custody. And it has conducted a large number of trials, fair trials, and a significant number of those who were responsible for great crimes in the former Yugoslavia have been convicted and have either finished serving or are still serving prison sentences. Moreover, the tribunal inspired the creation of domestic courts in Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia, which have all tried significant numbers of lower-ranking war criminals. And they, too, have conducted fair trials, and as a result, a large number of those who were principally responsible for the crimes in the former Yugoslavia have been held accountable. Similarly, with respect to Rwanda, a significant number of the persons who were most responsible for the genocide are serving long prison sentences today. And the creation of those tribunals has inspired what was referred to in introducing me by the name of a book called the Justice Cascade. That is, all over the world, today there are trials of government leaders, guerrilla leaders, military officials for significant abuses of human rights. One book published a couple of years ago counted some 67 prosecutions of heads of state or heads of government, either for human rights abuses or for corruption or both, between 1990 and 2009. Nothing like that ever took place previously. And one would have to say that today, if one is a head of state or head of government or a significant military leader engaged in abuses or thinking of engaging in what would be considered to be abuses, one has to take into account the significant possibility that one will eventually be held accountable for such crimes. I don't know that we're in a position to say whether this is now having a deterrent effect. If it is not yet having a deterrent effect, I think it will have a deterrent effect over a period of time. We have also the Permanent International Criminal Tribunal, Criminal Court. We have special courts for Sierra Leone, for Lebanon, for Cambodia. There really is a justice cascade today, and I think it is an accomplishment of the human rights movement responding to its own inability to mitigate the abuses in ex-Yugoslavia and in Rwanda as they were taking place, but at least to provide an opportunity over time to hold accountable those who were responsible for those abuses. With respect to Latin America, a couple of weeks ago or 10 days ago, a former Argentine president died in prison where he was serving for human rights abuses. The former president of Peru is serving a 25-year prison sentence for human rights abuses. A former dictator of Uruguay died in 2011, a year after being sentenced to 30 years in prison for human rights abuses. As I said at the beginning, Rios Montt was just tried in Guatemala. He got an 80-year sentence before the sentence was vacated. What will happen from now on, I don't know, but the historical verdict on Rios Montt was certainly rendered by the court that sat in that case. Another significant role that the human rights movement has tried to play in the post-Cold War period particularly is to modify abuses of human rights that take place in the course of armed conflict. By far the largest number and the most severe human rights abuses take place in armed conflict. Prior to the 1980s, only the International Committee of the Red Cross attempted to deal with abuses committed in armed conflict, and the nature of its work was that it was kept out of public view. The International Committee of the Red Cross long ago made the judgment that it would be most effective if it did its work without publicizing its activities, and so very few people were actually aware of the activities of the ICRC. Human Rights Watch began to publicize abuses of human rights in armed conflict during the wars of the 1980s in Central America. And I would say that today, the international human rights movement is, to a very substantial extent, preoccupied with trying to modify abuses in armed conflict. And I think this has had a significant effect in a number of conflicts. It probably had the largest effect earliest in the war in Kosovo, but it also was significant in Georgia's war with Russia, in Israel's war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, in Israel's war in Gaza. It has played a role, despite the slaughter that has taken place in Iraq and Afghanistan. Obviously, there are places where this has not had significant impact. What is going on today in Syria, or what is taking place in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, indicates how far one has to go in trying to have an impact on the abuses that take place in armed conflict. But an immense amount of progress has been made in this area. And there have been new developments relatively recently. For example, there's a small organization called the Center for Civilians in Conflict. And it grew out of the U.S. engagement in the Iraq War. And it managed to persuade the U.S. military, and this was ultimately put into legislation adopted by Congress, to pay damages to the families of civilians killed in Iraq by U.S. forces. And this has also taken place in Afghanistan, and now a number of other countries have also adopted schemes of that sort. So this is an innovation in international humanitarian law, and it indicates that there is more that can be done in this field. Another significant effort of the international human rights movement in recent years has been to try to limit the violations of rights that accompany what is referred to as the war on terror or the war on terrorism. And this has been very difficult. And at the same time, it has been successful in some degree. That is, one could have imagined far worse abuses than did take place. In the United States, the Bush administration allowed torture to take place with respect to detainees. The Obama administration came in making it very clear that it would not tolerate torture. Obama said he wanted to close Guantanamo. He was thwarted on that, but he has now renewed his effort to close Guantanamo. Questions have been raised about the targeted killings that the United States has engaged in through the use of drone warfare, and clearly this is having an impact, and the United States is rethinking its role with respect to these. There have been many efforts in other countries also to limit rights in the name of the war against terror. In the United Kingdom, for example, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown both pushed extended or prolonged detention without trial or charges, and they were defeated in the British Parliament. And it was essentially the human rights movement in the United Kingdom which organized the defeat of the measures promoted by Tony Blair. One could cite many other countries where there have been struggles of this sort. So I would say that in each of these areas, in the effort to secure accountability for great abuses of human rights, and the effort to mitigate the human rights abuses committed in armed conflict, and the effort to limit the abuses of human rights in the war against terrorism, the human rights movement has accomplished a lot on the one hand, and on the other hand has a great distance to go in order to achieve its purposes. I don't think it will again play the geopolitical role that it played in the Cold War, but I think the accomplishments that it has had in recent years are very significant. But those accomplishments inevitably at the same time indicate what has not been accomplished. So you can decide whether the glass is half full or half empty. I often err on the optimistic side and tend to think of it as half full, but I think those have been the accomplishments. Let me only conclude by saying that I think that the most significant accomplishment of all of the human rights movement is that governments everywhere know that if they engage in human rights abuses, they will not go unnoticed, that there are those out there who are intent on ferreting out information on abuses, documenting that information, circulating it, and using the information to have an impact. I think that effort, again, was greatly enhanced by the involvement of scientists in the work because their ability to analyze the information and their credibility when they analyze the information greatly enhances the movement. So again, that makes me very proud of the opportunity to deliver a lecture named for Bob Kirschner, who was a pioneer in the involvement of scientists in this work. Thank you very much. and I'm happy to answer questions with the one proviso that you only ask a question if you go to the microphone, so as to make sure that I can hear what you're asking.
Thank you very much for the talk and the work of your organization. I would like to ask, in light of President Obama's nomination of Ms. Samantha Power to be the new UN ambassador, and with regards to her background in human rights issues, what do you think, can you comment on this move, as well as, in general, what does human rights and humanitarian intervention play in U.S. foreign policy? Well,
I'm obviously very pleased at the nomination of Samantha Power. I've worked with her closely for quite a long time. I think she's 42 years old now, so I think I've worked with her for half of her life, since she was 21, and she was then an intern working for a close colleague of mine. I think Samantha made her reputation as an advocate of human rights, and I'm very glad that somebody who came to public attention as an outstanding advocate of human rights has been nominated for this position. And knowing Samantha, she will not forget about her concerns for human rights.
Yes, thank you very much for the wonderful points you brought out. You mentioned something about modifying abuse. I didn't quite understand that. And I'm wondering if so many leaders are being serving time for their abuse against citizens. What year did that start? Because I'm thinking about here in America, how the Native Americans were treated, as well as the people of African descent. And I'm wondering, the longer that the period goes on, who can you prosecute for this type of human rights abuse?
Well, I don't think you can prosecute for abuses that were committed by people who are no longer alive. I think you can, however, acknowledge those abuses. It's very important to acknowledge them, and there have been quite a lot of countries where governments have issued apologies for such abuses and have really investigated those abuses. You mentioned Native Americans, and let me just cite one example. One of the abuses against Native Americans, more recent than the slaughter that took place in the 19th century, was the use of the Indian schools, which were intended by the Bureau of Indian Services to, quote, de-Indianize Indians. That is, they were taken from small villages in different places and sent to schools in Utah and New Mexico. And I can remember being in Alaska and seeing the sort of Skid Row section of Anchorage, and you would see a very large number of drunken Native Americans on that Skid Row. And those who looked into it further would tell you that these were Native Americans, often Eskimos, who were taken from the villages in the northern parts of Alaska on the theory that the villages were too small for the Bureau of Indian Affairs to establish a school there, and sent to Utah, for example. And they were completely cut off from their own culture, but at the same time they acquired nothing in those schools that really turned out to be useful for them. And so they ended up on the Skid Row in Anchorage. Canada had the same practice as the United States. And 3 or 4 years ago, the Canadian government established a commission to examine its own practices with respect to Native American children, because they too had children in these remote villages, and the Eskimos were both on the Canadian side of the line and on the American side of the line. We haven't done anything equivalent to what the Canadians have done. And I think it would be important for us to acknowledge this just as it is important for the Canadians to acknowledge it.
I would be real happy to know how the Convention on the Rights of a Child could be lived up to here in America, as well as Somali. Those are the two countries that didn't accept it. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have such wonderful documents, but why can't we utilize them?
Yeah, well, as you say, we are not parties to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we eventually did become a party to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but with quite a few reservations and exceptions.
If the glass, I'm still trying to decide whether I agree with you that the glass is either half full or half empty.
Yes.
If it's half full with a good Chardonnay, then I totally agree with you in that respect. If you give me the opportunity to consume it. I wanted to ask you about the role of the human rights movement in terms of trying to curb trafficking in the sex trade among 12, 13, and 14-year-old girls in Thailand and elsewhere.
Well, there are organizations that have particularly focused on the trafficking and have helped to document the trafficking. I'm not familiar in detail with the work that has taken place in this area, but it is one of the areas where there are specialized organizations that have focused on the issue.
Thank you, Mr. Neier. My name is Sam Boland. I'm a first year in the college. You spoke to the efficacy of human rights organizations in prosecuting accountable individuals when they are in a presence of authority, and how effective that has been over the past 40 or so years. To use an extreme example, about a year ago I left the country of South Sudan, where I had worked for a year, and I saw a number of individuals die. I was working in medicine in a hospital, often because they couldn't afford something very simple, such as an IV cannula or normal saline or something of the sort. I was wondering if you could please elaborate on what you see as the potential and the responsibility of human rights organizations in situations when accountability is arguably untenable. Thank you.
Well, that's an important question. Human rights organizations have tended to focus in dealing with accountability on high officials, on the theory that they have the highest level of responsibility for various kinds of abuses. Obviously, there are a lot of abuses that people suffer that don't involve high officials, and human rights organizations have had limited capacity to deal with that. Sometimes, however, they are able to make an effort along those lines. For example, the foundation that I headed has supported an effort in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to hold accountable the military men and the militia men who have been involved in the sort of epidemic of rape that has taken place in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We financed mobile courts in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and those have been remarkably successful. That is, they have conducted good quality trials, and a significant number of military men from low-ranking men who have been engaged in those abuses to senior officers have been convicted and are serving prison sentences as a result of that effort. It's a big deal to try to finance something like a mobile court system. We are a large foundation, but we don't have the resources to substitute for the criminal justice system that has to exist in different countries to address issues of that sort. So the human rights movement can try to press public officials to address issues of that sort, but and very often it does this by documenting what takes place and trying to use publicity as a means of placing pressure on public officials. But most of the time, what it can do is to put pressure on officials. It isn't to itself provide a substitute, as we have done in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
My question, too, has to do with the question of the degree to which the glass is empty or full.
Okay.
I'm thinking that there's the cascade of justice, but it's always encountering the gradient of power. If one is a former president or secretary of state of a country like Guatemala or Serbia, one might be somewhat easy to capture and bring to justice. But of course, there are other people who are infinitely better protected, and yet whose own admissions of what they've done are on record and well known. So my question is, while I think we should celebrate the thing that you're bringing into visibility here, the organized character of the thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people involved in the human rights movement, what about the extraordinarily well-organized and elusive opposite thing that we might call the impunity movement? What are the inroads that might be made on the impunity movement? And if you know their clubhouse and where they meet, can we go?
No, I think impunity was just about absolute until relatively recently. This all began to change. I mentioned the establishment of the Yugoslav Tribunal. Actually, the change began in Argentina in 1983. That was the year of transition from a military dictatorship to a democratic government. And the military had to leave power because they had humiliated themselves in the Falklands War, the Malvinas War, with the United Kingdom. And before leaving power, they promulgated an amnesty law that they decreed, forgiving themselves for all of their crimes. And they had been responsible for many thousands of disappearances during the 7.5 years that they held power. And the leading presidential candidate then said that he regretted the amnesty, but he would go along with it. And the candidate who was somewhat behind said if he was elected, he would repudiate the amnesty. And he was elected, and he did repudiate the amnesty. And he created a commission on the disappeared, which Argentines named the Truth Commission, though that wasn't part of its name. And he also started prosecutions. And some of those prosecutions succeeded. His successor then pardoned those who had been prosecuted. But what happened in Argentina initiated this effort to end or to mitigate impunity. And in Argentina, eventually the courts ruled that a crime that had not been covered by the amnesty or the pardons, was the crime of stealing babies. What happened in Argentina is that when the young women who were pregnant were, quote, disappeared, they were held by the military until they gave birth and then immediately executed. And the babies were then given to military families that wanted to adopt children. And that crime was only discovered somewhat later on. And so prosecutions were brought for that crime even after the pardons. And that initiated a process whereby a larger number of prosecutions were brought in Argentina. And today, quite a lot of military men are in prison in Argentina for crimes committed between 1976 and 1983. And as I mentioned, a former president, a president during that period, General Jorge Videla, just died in prison. So impunity was severely limited in Argentina. And what happened in Argentina eventually spread to many other countries. So impunity has taken a beating in recent years. I'm very pleased to say.
Thank you.
Okay. One more question? Okay. Oh, sorry. I apologize to the people behind, but I'm being told one more question. Go ahead.
Thank you. You mentioned a number of the key tools and strategies that the human rights movement has used over the past few decades, naming and shaming, international criminal accountability, investigations through science, through social sciences, hard sciences. Yet many human rights abuses are evolving, and there are new abuses, whether they're online, the changing nature of war from interstate to primarily intrastate. And so I'm wondering if you might recall from other fields or imagine new tools and strategies that the human rights movement might incorporate in the years to come.
It's always sort of wonderful to come up with new approaches to dealing with human rights abuses. I mentioned before that there is this small organization which has been promoting compensation for civilians who are killed in conflict. What happened in that case is one young woman from California, very young, got very concerned about the war in Iraq, traveled to Iraq, came up with this idea, managed to meet with General Petraeus and get Petraeus to agree this was a good idea. She also managed to meet with a congressional aide, an assistant to Senator Pat Leahy, and she persuaded him that it was a good idea. And he persuaded me that we should fund her activities. And then she was going to the airport in Baghdad, and she was killed by a suicide bomber on the way to the airport. And I thought this effort would die with her. and another young woman has taken it over and has been immensely effective in dealing with military forces in different parts of the world about their responsibility to make sure that civilians don't get killed in their activities. And the payment of compensation has a way of dramatizing this to the military themselves, as well as being something of value to the families that are involved. So that's an innovation that came from people who were essentially untutored in the human rights field, and they have made the experienced people in the field sort of follow along in their footsteps in promoting an approach of this sort. These things come along from time to time, and one needs to be open to innovation in the field. There are many different ways. I remember sometimes it's the way in which you discuss human rights abuses. I remember in the earliest days when I was dealing with the Soviet Union and abuses of human rights, I had become a friend of the Russian poet Joseph Brodsky, who was exiled in the United States. And Brodsky said to me, when you denounce Soviet abuses, you should refer to them as barbaric or as uncivilized. He said because Russians worry a great deal about that. They don't like to be seen as barbaric or uncivilized. So if you say the abuses are barbaric or uncivilized, you get under their skin and it will have an effect. And I think he was right. You often have to tailor the way you go about efforts to promote human rights to the particular circumstance. In Russia, also another significant factor is under the Soviet Union, scientists had a privileged place. And therefore, by enlisting scientists in one's work, one had an increased impact. And it was no accident that it was scientists like Andrei Sakharov and Yuri Orlov who were in the forefront of the effort to promote human rights in the former Soviet Union. Different professions have different levels of prestige in different countries, and understanding the circumstances of the particular country very often enables one to be more effective in the way in which one promotes human rights.